is Lisa Smith. I'm the library director. Thank you so much for joining us early. Okay. He says they have. Whoops. All right. So it's noon. You joined us a little bit early. You already heard Tim and I trying to determine whether or not we were going to give everybody a couple of minutes. So we think we should. I'm going to mute myself, and we'll give everybody till a couple of minutes after to have everybody join us if they're probably grabbing lunch and getting back from other meetings. So we'll be back to you in a couple of minutes. Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started today. We thought we'd give everybody a couple of minutes to join us, and we appreciate you coming. I just thought I'd go ahead and introduce you. Today we're going to launch our inaugural series. It's called Stories from the Archives, our webinar. My name is Lisa Smith, and I'm the director of the UAMS Library. The library is really fortunate to be the home of the Historical Research Center, and you see Tim Nutt here is with us. He's the director of the Historical Research Center, and that center houses our historical archives, manuscripts, and artifacts related to the history of medicine in Arkansas. And it's located on our 5th floor in the library itself. If you've had a chance to visit, it's open and available. They schedule appointments, but it's up on the 5th floor. And we've actually had, certainly predates my arrival at the institution, but the Historical Research Center was kind of founded or became an entity in 1978. And about 3 years later, a society was formed to actually help promote more about the history of medicine and the materials in the Historical Research Center. So in 1981, they came on board and they sponsor lectures. They actually sponsor research awards, special projects. And that group is very active today in supporting the Historical Research Center. So on the Historical Research Center website, if you're interested in learning more about that, they'd be happy to share information about the society with you. The physical collection right now is about processed. The physical processed collection that has been processed is over 1,000 linear feet, but we have much more materials than that. So sitting up on that 5th floor, they have their materials that are being processed. But we have a satellite and remote facility where even more collections are housed. And that's why it's so important to just create as much awareness as possible about the collections. Tim and his team work on that consistently. But we're really excited that Andrea Hayes, the UAMS outreach librarian, conceptualized this specific program. And she worked with Tim and the Historical Research Center, also the Division for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So the 3 entities working together to pull together this program. And they really will do what we talked about. They'll focus on creating awareness of those historical archives and collections. And today's specific focus, Tim will be discussing the works and papers of Dr. George Ish, and he's a prominent Arkansan and clinician of color. And so I want to thank Tim and Andrea Hayes and the HRC team for pulling this together. This is going to be a quarterly series, so we hope you'll join us in the future in these sessions and enjoy today. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and pass it over to Tim so he can start the actual program.
Thank you, Lisa. Appreciate all the kind words, and I appreciate Andrea Hayes's help, Stephanie Gafford's help. Both of them are in our Education and Research Services department here in the library, and I appreciate all their help with it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and I am so excited about this this new series that we're starting. We're calling it Stories from the Archives, and as you can tell, I am literally in the archives up on the 5th floor. And today so the whole concept behind this series is we're going to take some artifacts from our collection, tell you a little bit about the artifacts, what they are, how they were used perhaps, but we're also going to tell you about the individuals behind those artifacts. And today I'm especially pleased because we're going to be talking about Dr. George W. S. Ish. And he was such a significant person in the early part of Little Rock history, state history, as far as in the medical community. He's just a really remarkable individual. And I am so pleased that we recently received some artifacts from of Dr. Ish's. And so that was I wanted to do that as our the focus of our premiere episode of Stories from the Archives. So there will be time for questions, I believe, at the end. So please feel free to ask questions if you'd like, and let's go ahead and just get started into this. A little bit about the UAMS Historical Research Center, as Lisa mentioned just a little bit about it. We are the only archives in the state dedicated to the preservation of the health sciences history of Arkansas. There are other archives located throughout the state, very good archives, but their focus is general Arkansas history. And so they may have one or two collections that deal with the medical history of Little Rock or the health sciences history of the state as a whole, or maybe a particular doctor. But the UAMS Historical Research Center is the only archives that its main focus is the health sciences history of Arkansas. And so we are really proud to have that role in the state. And I would encourage you, after listening to this presentation, if you have any artifacts or collections that you feel might be appropriate for our collection, I'd encourage you to give us a call, and I'd love to talk with you about it. Now, archives, you may know what archives collect, but if not, I'm just going to give a brief overview of just some of the types of materials that all archives collect. Of course, every archive is going to have photographs. We have photographs documenting the history of the medical school, its different locations around the city of Little Rock, from the Sparandio restaurant on 2nd Street to its current location on Markham Street. So we have those photographs. We have photographs from around the state of various doctors, various health institutions, various organizations that deal with health issues. And then we also have pamphlets and books that document the health sciences in Arkansas. Of course, what you're seeing on the screen now is the 1879 catalog of Arkansas Industrial University, which became the University of Arkansas in 1899. 1879, if you remember your history, is the first year that the medical school opened classes. And so that is a very unique piece in our collection because it talks about the very first year that the medical school started. In addition to pamphlets and items like that, we also have a history of medicine book collection, about 7,000 volumes in that history of medicine that does not deal specifically with Arkansas, but it's the history of medicine in general terms. So there are some Arkansas books scattered in there, but it's mostly history of medicine generally. And we also have, of course, letters, correspondence. You're seeing on your screen, again, going back to 1879, a letter to Dr. P.O. Hooper, one of the founders of UAMS, of the medical school, talking about the purchase of the Sparandio Hotel and restaurant. And ephemera. Ephemera sometimes gets mixed up and people don't know what exactly ephemera is. Ephemera is that stuff that really was never meant to be saved. So if you think about flyers that you see tacked up on light posts and receipts like this one, this is a receipt for one of the payments that the founders made on the medical school building. So all that material, things like that, anything that's documenting the history of the medical community, the health sciences community in Arkansas, we're going to try to acquire that and preserve it. Now, one thing that we do here at the UAMS Historical Research Center is that we also collect artifacts. And a lot of archives do not collect artifacts. That's usually in the purview of museums. And so if you think of the UAMS Historical Research Center, we're sort of a combination of an archives and a museum. Here's just a few examples of some of the artifacts that we collect. We have a brick from the student dormitory that was demolished in 2006 for the new hospital. We have a piece of medical equipment, the portable anesthesia machine you see on your screen, of course, microscopes. And then we also have things such as a head of a costume. This was RF Ant, an anti-drug campaign put on by UAMS in the late 80s, 1990s. And so we have things like that. And then we also get things that the gentleman on your screen saved. And we were so pleased that his family decided to donate these materials to the collection. And Mr. Donald Stex, he was a registered pharmacist. He graduated from the College of the Ozarks, their pharmacy program. And if you're not familiar with that, you're probably thinking, I didn't know College of the Ozarks in Clarksville had a pharmacy program. They don't anymore, but for a time before the College of Pharmacy here at the University of at UAMS was founded in the 1950s, the pharmacy program was at the College of the Ozarks in Clarksville. And so that's where Mr. Stex graduated from, 1951, I believe. And it was after he graduated from Clarksville, moved to Little Rock, opened up, worked at a number of drugstores around the city, owned and operated a number of those for many, many, many years. And it was during this time that he was offered the George Ish collection. I believe the story is that a customer came in that started talking about history, and Dr. George Ish's name came up, and this customer had these materials of Dr. Ish's, and Mr. Stex, knowing the historical significance of Dr. Ish and of these materials, acquired these materials and preserved them for many years, and just recently they were donated here to the UAMS Historical Research Center. So I'm very, very happy that Mr. Stex had the foresight to save these materials, and I'm so thankful for his family and for Mr. Stex as well for donating these to us. And I believe one of his daughters, Lisa, is in the audience today. So Lisa, thank you for being here, and thank you for everything that your father has done. Now, in addition to the Ish, I'll just make this as a brief side note so we can actually get into talking about Dr. Ish. But Mr. Stex, as a pharmacist, of course, he was also interested in the history of medicine, the pills and drugs. And so he also collected this vast medicine bottle collection, and we received that, and we're so pleased to have it. It's a pretty mind-boggling collection just to see the sheer number of medicine bottles and sort of these quack medicines that were produced back in the early 1900s, late 1880s. And so we're working on that collection right now. We're hoping we will be doing an exhibit on that, and hopefully one of these sessions, one of these stories from the archives, will talk about that collection as well. But Mr. Stex was just a great individual, and he lover of history, obviously, and so glad that he was able to preserve these materials. So these are just a few of the materials that of Dr. Ish's that Mr. Stex saved. On your left, you'll see a notepad, prescription pad of Dr. Ish. At the lower right, you'll see a pair of his eyeglasses. And above the eyeglasses, you'll see the fez for a fraternal organization that he belonged to, the United Friends of America. We're going to talk a little bit about the United Friends of America and how that was important in itself in the medical history of Little Rock. So these materials, there are also some books that Dr. Ish owned in the collection. His seal, if you remember those really heavy iron seals that you press down on, sort of like a notary public has. So those are the parts of the Dr. George Ish collection that we received from the Stex family. And so I'm going to use these materials and these artifacts to talk about Dr. Ish and his importance in Arkansas history, and the importance of his importance in the medical history of Arkansas and Little Rock. So just a little bit about Dr. Ish, Dr. George William Stanley Ish, great name, isn't it? He was actually born here in Little Rock, and his father was Dr. Jefferson Ish, excuse me. And if you there used to be he was a prominent educator here in the city, and there used to be an Ish elementary school that was named after Dr. Ish's father, Jefferson Ish. His mother, Marietta Ish, was also an educator here in Little Rock. So he came from a very prominent African-American family here in Little Rock. He was born in 1883 in Little Rock in a house at 1600 Scott Street. And he actually lived in that house until his death in 1970. Unfortunately, the house was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Unfortunately, it was damaged by a fire in 1996. There were plans to restore it, but the tornado that devastated downtown Little Rock in 1999 made it impossible to restore. So unfortunately, we lost the Ish house to nature and natural disasters. But Dr. Ish, so he grew up in Little Rock. He attended Little Rock schools. And of course, if you know your history, at that time, the schools were segregated. He went to Union School, I believe. But even though there was segregation in Little Rock at that time in the late 1880s after Reconstruction, in the early 1900s, Little Rock was considered one of the moderate cities in the South when it came to race relations. There was a very little animosity between blacks and whites during that time, or very little that was reported on, but there was very little instances of violence between the two races. So Dr. Ish grows up in Little Rock. He graduates from high school. He goes to college in Talladega, Alabama. He goes to Talladega College. He earns a degree there. We don't know what degree he received from Talladega College. We do know he graduated in about, I believe it was 1902. He then he gets accepted into, let's see, my slides might be out of order. My slides are out of order. He then went to Yale University, where he got another bachelor's degree. So we're not quite sure why he got two bachelor's degree. But then after he graduated from Yale, he got accepted into Harvard Medical School. And this was a pretty rare occurrence in the South. Usually African Americans who wanted to become physicians, they ended up going to Meharry University in Nashville, which was the predominantly and historically Black medical school. And so it's unusual that an African American from the South would actually go to Harvard for medical school. But from all accounts, he graduated in 1909. From all accounts, he did exceptionally well at Harvard. After Harvard, he does an internship at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C. The Freedmen's Hospital was set up after the Civil War. It grew out of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established by the U.S. government to help freed African Americans after the Civil War. This hospital was built in Washington, D.C. right after that. And then and it remained that it was called the Freedmen's Hospital until mid-1970s when it was renamed the Howard University, and it's still affiliated with Howard University in Washington, D.C. So Dr. Ish does his internship at Freedmen's Hospital, and then he returns to Little Rock, and he stays in Little Rock for the rest of his life. He goes into general practice, but he has surgery as a specialty within that general practice. So he gets back to Little Rock about the 19-teens, and he sets up his office. His office was located in the historically African-American section of Little Rock around 9th Street, 9th and Chester. And so he puts his office there, and around there he has other physicians who and other African-American businesses located in this area of Little Rock. And he was very successful. He saw both African-American and white patients, which again was a little bit unusual, but it goes and testifies to his reputation as a doctor and how prominent he was, Dr. Ish was, in Little Rock, that he saw both patients of both races. 1915, he marries Lily Johnson, and they have 4 kids. One of their children becomes a doctor, and another one of their sons becomes a doctor. The other son becomes an educator, and he also had 2 daughters. Unfortunately, I don't know what his 2 daughters did. The research, unfortunately, as you know, sometimes finding information on women is not easy, and that's unfortunate. So he has a very successful practice in the 9th Street area of Little Rock. And he starts making these significant contributions to Little Rock medical history. 1918, he, with other African-American doctors, established the Bush Memorial Hospital. This was the first hospital operated in the state, established in the state for and owned by African-Americans. So again, African-Americans would be seen in other hospitals, like at that time it would have been St. Vincent, maybe I don't believe Baptist had its hospital set up yet, but St. Vincent did have an area for African-American patients, but it was just a small area. I think it had like 3 or 4 beds for African-Americans. So the Bush Memorial Hospital, when it was established in 1918, was the first hospital that provided medical attention to African-Americans in the city. And if you can read the ad on the page, you'll notice some of the other doctors. Dr. J.M. Robinson, of course, you see Dr. Ish, Fred T. Jones, J. Otis Hickman, J.P. Runyon. All these individuals were very, very prominent physicians in Little Rock, prominent African-American physicians in Little Rock. So there was a group of prominent African-American physicians that made these huge impacts into Little Rock history, and changed the medical scene in Little Rock. So the Bush Memorial Hospital starts in 1918. And I'm going to use one of the artifacts from Dr. Ish, his fez from the United Friends of America. The United Friends of America was established in 1918, about the same time as the Bush Memorial Hospital was established. United Friends was a fraternal organization specifically for African Americans. You might have heard of the Mosaic Templars of America. That was also a African American fraternal organization. The United Friends was established by Reverend C.D. Pettaway of Little Rock. And if you're familiar with Little Rock, downtown Little Rock, if you go down Main Street past maybe around Daisy Bates and a little bit past there down to like 21st, 23rd, that's the Pettaway neighborhood. And so that neighborhood is named after Reverend C.D. Pettaway. So Reverend Pettaway establishes the United Friends of America in 1918. And then one of the outgrowths from this fraternal organization comes a hospital. So you had the Bush Memorial Hospital. That unfortunately did not last very long, but the new fraternal hospital that catered to the United Friends of America and the Independent Order of Immaculates, it was established in 1919. And I have a picture of Dr. Fred T. Jones on the screen. You saw his name earlier, associated with the Bush Memorial Hospital. He was associated with the United Friends of America. He was also associated with the New Fraternal Hospital for the United Friends, and he was actually one of the owners and the superintendent of the hospital. Dr. Jones himself deserves a program because he too was so impactful on the medical scene in Little Rock and across the state. Actually, he established hospitals in Pine Bluff and in Little Rock. But in 1919, he was one of the founders of the United Friends of America Hospital in Little Rock. And again, the names on the ad are the same people that you see appearing over and over and over again when you're talking about, when you delve into the history of African American history, dealing with medicine in Little Rock. You'll see these same names over and over and over again. Here's just another picture in the 1950s from the United Friends Hospital. It was located on West 10th Street in that area that was predominantly historically African American business district. The hospital operated until 1970, and that is when Dr. Ish died. But until that time, he performed surgery at this hospital. He was a key figure in administering to the patients at this hospital and numerous other hospitals around the city. Dr. Ish had attended patients at St. Vincent's, Baptist, and other hospitals in Little Rock. And again, it was attending both to white and African American patients. He was not limited to just administering to the African American community. He was a doctor to all the races. Another interesting and significant contribution that Dr. Ish made was to the treatment of individuals with tuberculosis. Tuberculosis had impacted, it was a big impact, a big impact on Arkansas. And in 1909, the state built the Arkansas TB Sanatorium outside of Booneville. And over the years, the Arkansas TB Sanatorium, I saw around 300,000 patients. But unfortunately, it wasn't until the early 1930s that there was an institution, a sanatorium, that for treatment for African Americans with tuberculosis. Before that time, African Americans who contracted tuberculosis basically were just not treated or sent home to die. They were either sent to poorhouses, they were sent back to their homes, and there was very little treatment given to African Americans with TB. That changed in 1933, I believe, when a separate institution was built specifically for the African American community, and especially those who suffered from TB. And the reason that the McCray Sanatorium was built was through the efforts of Dr. George Ish. Without him, this institution, the McCray Memorial Sanatorium in Alexander, would not have been built, and there would not have been any treatment given, most likely, to African Americans with TB. And so just the number of people that were saved through the efforts of Dr. Ish, through the founding of the McCray Sanatorium, it's just incalculable. And it's just mind-boggling that it would take from 1909 to 1933 to have a separate facility, or a facility at all, for African Americans, and not to have them receive the same treatment. Of course, you know that was the standard of the time, unfortunately. But as I mentioned, 1933, the McCray Memorial Sanatorium was created through the efforts of Dr. George Ish. The McRae, it's named after Governor Tom McRae, who also advocated for its building and treatment of African Americans with tuberculosis. Now, this was just not a sort of another generous and activity or generous event in Dr. Ish's life, because one of his research topics, one of the pieces of the topics of research that he was interested in was pulmonary tuberculosis. And so this was a cause very dear to his heart. And thank goodness that he had the foresight and the determination to continue working on this and getting the McRae Memorial Sanatorium built. I have a picture of O.B. White, Dr. O.B. White, who was a superintendent, a friend of Dr. Ish's. Dr. White served as the superintendent of the McRae Sanatorium for many, many years. If not, it might be for the entire length of the time that the sanatorium was open. It opened in early 1930s. And I believe in the mid 1960s, it was closed down and the patients were transferred to the Boonville Sanatorium. And then the sanatorium at Boonville closed in 1973 when different practices and theories on how to treat TB victims or TB patients were being implemented. Now, unfortunately, as I mentioned, there was segregation in the medical community here in Little Rock. As I mentioned, I also mentioned that the race relations in late 1880s, early 1900s was considered pretty were moderate considered it throughout the South as opposed to other cities. But that did not mean, just because the race relations were not bad, did not mean that African Americans were not discriminated against. And this is an example when of the AMDPA, the Arkansas Medical, Dental, and Pharmaceutical Association. They created, the African Americans created their own organization in 1893 when they were not allowed to join the Arkansas Medical Society or the Pulaski County Medical Society, a chapter of the Arkansas Medical Society. So they created the AMDPA in 1893. Dr. Ish was the first president of the Pulaski County chapter of the AMDPA. He was one of the founders of the organization itself. Dr. J.G. Thornton was a founder of the AMDPA also. And so Dr. Ish, when he returned, he was not a founder. I said he was a founder of it. He did not join the AMDPA until he returned to Little Rock from Harvard Medical School in the mid-teens. But from his returning to Little Rock in the mid-1910s, he was actively involved in the organization, the AMDPA Association, the Pulaski County chapter of the AMDPA. And it wasn't until 1953 that the Pulaski County Medical Society opened admission to African Americans. It was in 1953 that they admitted 4 African Americans to the membership. O.B. White, who we mentioned was head of the superintendent of the McRae Sanatorium, J.M. Robinson, Dr. Ish, and Hugh Brown. And so that is, of course, very late in allowing African Americans to join the organization, but it was also before Central High in 1957, and but there was no, when the group finally decided to admit African Americans, there was very little, if none, if no dissent. And so that in itself was an achievement, just to have these African Americans finally admitted to the Pulaski County Medical Society. I've not been able to determine when the Arkansas Medical Society admitted African Americans, but I'm working on that. So Dr. Ish, he has this long career. But he dies in 1970, March of 1970. His death is reported in both statewide newspapers, Arkansas Gazette, Arkansas Democrat, newspapers around the country, the Southern Mediator, which was a newspaper on targeted to African Americans, the Detroit Free Press. Just nationally, he was known for his career, and he was honored and given accolades for all that he had done to Little Rock. He'd been in Little Rock for over 50 years. He had served the medical community for over 50 years, and he had been involved in the founding of numerous hospitals, Bush Memorial Hospital. I mentioned the Fraternal Hospital, United Friends of America Hospital. He had Dr. Wrights at St. Vincent's Hospital, Baptist Hospital. And so he was truly a significant individual in the medical history of Little Rock. And he impacted a lot of people. And just think of how many young men and women he impacted, and maybe encouraged them to go to medical school or to live whatever dream they wanted to be. So Dr. Ish, very, very significant individual. In 2016, because of that contribution, because of his contributions to medical history, when UAMS College of Medicine divided up their classes, or the college, into academic houses, sort of like Harry Potter, one of the houses was named after Dr. Ish. And I think he would have been really pleased with that, and to have his contributions recognized. And I am so glad that UAMS recognized his contributions and named an academic house after him. And I am so glad that, again, for the Stex family for donating the George Ish collection to us. It's a small collection, but it's so impactful, regardless of its size. It's so impactful, and we're so thankful to have this unique piece of African American medical history in our collections. And again, thanks to Donald Stex, who's a pharmacist, but he also a history lover, and knew the significance of the Ish collection. And so this is, I think that might be the end. That's the end of this, but I think we have time for some questions. I think if we can use the chat feature to answer questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone has. And I will say that Dr. Ish is such, the reason I chose Dr. Ish today is because we received these materials from Mr. Stex and the Stex family. But there are just so many other significant individuals who have not been recognized or have sort of been lost to history. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do at the Historical Research Center, is bring their names back into the forefront. One of the projects that we're working on, specifically dealing with women of color in medicine, and that's a project that we're working on. We have a digital archivist who's working on that, and doing a digital project on that. So that's just one example that what we're trying to do here. We do have a question. Do we have an idea of how many African-American physicians were practicing in Arkansas at the time Dr. Ish received his degree from Harvard? I'm not certain about the total number in Arkansas. In Little Rock, I believe there were about 15 African-American physicians in Little Rock. Not just physicians, but across the health sciences. So that would be dentists, physicians, and one of the dentists operating in Little Rock at that time, Dr. James H. Smith, who received his dental degree from Chicago and moved to Little Rock after the Great Fire in Chicago, 1873. He also saw both white and black patients. And so I think that goes to that shows not only how well they were thought of in Little Rock, but also just how good of physicians and health professionals they were. Are any of these previous hospitals still standing or have landmarks? Unfortunately, no, none that I know of. The United Friends Hospital, I think, was torn down in the 70s, I believe. I think when 630 went through, I think that took a lot of 10th Street and the buildings on 10th Street. And then the Bush Memorial Hospital, I think it was turned into something else after it was closed, but I'm not sure if it's still standing. I'm not sure about that. Are there any plans to have any permanent installations across UAMS to share these histories and educate visitors? We have lots of empty walls. We have actually, thank you, Benjamin, for that comment. We've actually been thinking about that and thinking about the best way to honor these individuals and educate the people who visit the hospital on a regular basis. And so if anyone has any ideas about that, I'd love to talk with you about it. So please feel free to email me. My email is tgnutt, N-U-T-T, @uams.edu. When did the first Black person graduate from an Arkansas medical school? That was Dr. Edith Irby Jones. She was the first African-American admitted to a historically all-white public medical school. She was admitted to UAMS in 1948. She graduated in 1952. Is Dr. Ish's name still associated with COM as one of the student houses? It is indeed. And I hope it stays as one of the houses for years to come, forever, actually. I think it's such a great tribute to his contributions. And again, I think UAMS did a great job when they chose not just him, but the other people that they chose to honor by naming the academic houses out after them. We have any other questions? Dr. Ish was the physician for the Wrightsville Boys School. Did his tenure there cover the fire in 1959? He was the physician at the Wrightsville Boys School, also called the Boys Industrial School, I think at one time. There was a fire in 1959, which unfortunately, there were a number of boys who could not get out of the school and perished in the fire. I don't know exactly when he was at the Wrightsville Boys School. I think it was after the fire, but I'm not positive about that. I will check and let you know, John, about that. And I will let everyone know about it. And I'll also say that this is being recorded, this presentation. And so once I receive the link, we will send the link out, and please forward it to anyone you think might be interested in learning more about Dr. Ish. Thank you, John. I'm glad you learned something a little bit more about Dr. Ish. He was a great person. There are the society, Lisa Smith in the introduction, she mentioned the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions. If you're not a member, we'd love to have you as a member. Dues are relatively inexpensive, $15 for an individual. But one of the things that the society does is sponsor a monthly Zoom virtual program. It's called Stay at Home Lecture Series. We started at the beginning of the pandemic, thinking it was just going to be a short series, but here we are over a year later. And those are held every first Thursday from 7 to 8, and on various Arkansas history, medical topics, health sciences topics. And those are recorded as well and put on our website. And then this presentation will be put, a link will be put on our website as well, the Historical Research Center website. So if you'll go to the library website and then find the historical research page, there will be a link for this website that you'll be able to forward to other people or watch again if you'd like. We have any other questions? Well, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. We're really excited about this new series, Stories from the Archives. And I think it's going to really be fun looking at artifacts and telling the stories behind the artifacts and the individuals associated with them. I'm excited about it, and I'm glad that I was able to use Dr. Ish's artifacts for this very first presentation in this series. So thank you all. Thank you again to Donald Stacks and his daughter Lisa, who's here. Lisa, it's good to see you virtually. And thank you all for being here, and we will hopefully see you next time. We'll send out promotion and publicity materials whenever we pull the next one together. So everyone stay safe. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.